Today's lesson is Lesson 12, We the People. The newly minted Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The tumultuous years of war were finally over. Now their country could settle into a new identity as an independent nation, united under common ideals. At least that was the idea. But as you will see, defining the details of this identity was not quite that simple. Almost immediately, problems began to arise that called for action. While some Americans believed each state should be run however its people saw fit, events of the next years caused another group to feel the opposite. They felt the federal central government needed to be stronger. These two groups, known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, were forced into a compromise that ended in the creation of the United States Constitution, which still governs the country over 200 years later. While their disagreements were many, their dedication to an improved government came first, as you can hear in the opening line of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The story of Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, was one that was convinced many American leaders that a new governing doctrine was absolutely necessary. Shays arrived home after his service in the war to an unpleasant surprise. While fighting for independence, his debts were added up. This wasn't the worst part, though. He had no way of paying what he owed because he had never been paid as a soldier. Can you imagine how appreciated he must have felt? Unappreciated, rather. As he began talking to neighbors and friends, he heard his own story echoed in the lives of many other veterans. They joined their voices and petitioned the Massachusetts government together for assistance in paying their debts, but they were refused. Not only did the state government refuse, but they also put more taxes on the already penniless individuals. Higher taxes and a government that doesn't listen or show sympathy to its people. Does this sound familiar? It certainly did to the citizens of Massachusetts. They felt like their own government was mirroring the British government, the same one they had just fought to free themselves from. What became known as Shays' Rebellion began, and over the next few years, several protests followed, leading up to a violent confirmation in 1787 at a weapons storehouse. While the rebellion was ultimately stopped by a private militia funded by the state of Massachusetts, the rebellion itself worried both the Massachusetts and federal governments. They felt they needed a national army and more power to raise money to deal with such situations such as this. The Articles of Confederation of 1781 to 1789. The Articles of Confederation, passed by the Congress in 1781, was the written document that outlined how a new government would run after independence was won in the Revolutionary War. It was an agreement between the individual states, and it gave the federal government very little power. Each state had its own constitution and was like an individual country in an alliance with the others. The document held the federal government responsible for defending the country and keeping it free, but didn't equip it to do so. While it was written quickly and in response to sudden independence by the late 1780s, it was no longer sufficient to hold together a unified country. The Constitutional Convention of 1787. Events like Shays' Rebellion were becoming more common. Paying off war debts were still an important issue. The people of America were dissatisfied, and Federalists, those who supported a powerful federal government, believed they had the answer to some of these problems. Remember George Washington and his longing for a peaceful retirement? He felt so strongly that the government needed a complete overhaul that he returned to the Philadelphia Convention to join 54 other representatives to adapt the Articles of Confederation. The meeting became known as the Constitutional Convention convention later. Most of the delegates had no idea the agenda included writing a constitution. Washington was among a group of representatives that had bigger plans than simply revision. They wanted to totally renovate the government in form of a constitution. Just as compromise was key in writing of the Declaration of Independence, so it was in writing of the Constitution. Federalists like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin believed the United States could not survive without a reimagined federal government. Yet anti-federalists felt the freedom brought by the Revolutionary War could only be maintained without an increase in governmental power. The debate over this took many forms, and the discussion continued over the long summer of 1787. Issues such as how the states would be represented in the legislature, the part of the government that makes laws, how much power the president would have, and how the Constitution would be changed, if necessary, surfaced during the debate. Finally, on September 17, 1787, representatives signed the document, making history by creating the first national constitution in the world. Let's take a closer look to see how the compromise that were reached and how they changed the government of the United States. The Articles of Confederation. Concerning taxes, the Congress could only request, not demand, that the state pay taxes. The court system under this confederation said no federal courts that had power over all 13 states. The president didn't have much power and merely ran the congressional meetings. Military, the Congress could only request, not demand, soldiers to defend the country. Sovereignty, states governed themselves. Now, with the Constitution, taxes gave the right to the government to collect taxes. And the court system set up a Supreme Court, the final word in the whole country. The president established the executive branch of the government with the president in charge of it. The military, Congress gave the right to draft an army if necessary. Sovereignty, Constitution became ultimate law in all 13 states. The first presidential election. If you live in the United States, you probably remember at least one presidential election. In modern times, they are hard to miss. There are television commercials, banners, and mailers sent out to homes promote candidates everywhere you look. The first presidential election was quite different. There were few candidates who were ever known outside beside the local area. One exception was the war hero, a name that had been on many American lips throughout the past years, George Washington. Electors, men chosen by each state to cast their vote for president, gathered on February 4th, 1789, to cast their ballots, and each elector voted for two people. All of the 69 ballots included a vote for Washington. Can you believe that the first presidential election was unanimous? As the runner-up, John Adams was elected vice president. They were inaugurated on August 30th, 1789, amid great celebration in New York City. Even many who disagreed with federalism were won over by the fact that Washington supported it. They believed in him, so they were willing to put aside their concerns about a strong federal government. The Bill of Rights. The Federalists accomplished what they hoped for with the approval of the Constitution and the election of Washington. However, many anti-Federalists believed the government had been given too much power, and they felt the freedom of the states and individuals were at risk. In fact, the Constitution may have been ratified, approved formally, by the necessary 9 states if the authors had not made a promise to the skeptics. They promised to write a Bill of Rights, a list of rights referring to the basic freedoms citizens of the United States could claim. These are also referred to as the first 10 amendments. If you are getting ready to plant a garden and your soil is rocky or sandy, you amend or add to it by adding valuable nutrients to help your plants flourish. You can think of the 10 amendments in the same way. They added clarity to the Constitution and made the soil of the American government better suited to nourish its citizens. So what exactly were these rights? Let's take a closer look at some of the highlights of the 10 additions to the Constitution. They were approved only about 3 years after its ratification. The First Amendment was freedom of religion and speech. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms or weapons. The Third Amendment, citizens could not be forced to feed and house soldiers. The Fourth Amendment, freedom from being searched without a reason. The Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendment, the rights surrounding what happens when someone is accused of a crime, including the right to a fair trial. The Eighth Amendment, freedom from cruel punishment. The Ninth Amendment, the right of citizens to make decisions that the Constitution doesn't specifically assign to the federal government. The 10th Amendment, the right of states to make decisions that the Constitution doesn't specifically assign to the federal government. You are probably familiar with at least some of these amendments, and there's a good reason for that. They are some of the most fundamental rights of the citizens of the United States, woven into the fabric of its government. Historically, they represent the compromise between those who wanted a more powerful government and those who feared the same thing. This was not the end of the additions to the Constitution, though. Since the Bill of Rights, there have been 17 more amendments added. The last was passed relatively recently in 1992. While intense conflict could continue to surround the question of the government's role, and still does today, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights brought clarity and compromise at the same moment in history when the United States needed nothing more. And in your Let's Talk About It, which of the first 10 amendments do you see as the most important and why? And that concludes our Lesson 12 for today. Thanks.